Dave Wedge. I do a lot of things. I'm an author, I'm a journalist, and I'm actually a communications and political consultant. It's funny because, I always wanted to do a book, and I had some other opportunities to do books with other cases and stories that I worked on over the years, but nothing really grabbed me. Nothing really ignited that passion in me where I said, you know what, I'm going to take a year or two out of my life and dedicate it to this. I started in 1993 at some smaller papers and moved up to the Herald in 99, and it was pre-internet, pre-cell phone, so we didn't have any internet in the newsroom. So when I first started at the Herald, we would have to go to town halls and dig up clips and the microfilm and all that old-timey stuff. But I think it made me ultimately a better journalist because I learned the value of getting out and getting the story. That's where I got some of my best stories over the year, was digging through records in public buildings. The first big story I covered, like national story, was the Worcester cold storage fire, and I had only been at the Herald for a couple of weeks, and I'll never forget going out and just doing some shoe leather reporting, trying to interview firefighters, stopping by firehouses, trying to find out who was involved in this, and try to find some stories about guys that worked on the fire. And at the end of my day of reporting, when I had to file it, I had to go to an actual payphone and call it back into the Herald. So I called this guy, Paul Sullivan, and I started kind of rambling, and he said, "Kid, take a deep breath. Where are you?" I said, "I'm at a restaurant." He said, "Sit down at the bar, have a beer, get your thoughts together, write it all out, and call me back." And it really stuck with me to throughout my reporting career, to kind of take a breath, kind of absorb everything that's happened and think about it, and then start to write. So that's what I did that day, and it served me well throughout my career. My boss called and said, "Turn on the TV." I looked and I saw one plane had hit, and he said, "Get to New York." And I was like, "Why? It's a plane crash in New York." And he said, "Well, we think the plane left from Logan." And as soon as he said that on live TV, the second plane hit, and then we knew. He was like, "Get going." So I got in my car and I drove down, and I got into the Bronx and parked my car up around 200th Street and just grabbed my notebook, the clothes on my back, and walked. And I walked to, 50, 60 blocks, took the train for 50, 60 blocks, and then walked the rest, and got into Lower Manhattan shortly after the buildings came down. And when I got there, it was, like what you saw on TV. I stayed down there for 2 weeks, and, it obviously impacted me personally. And I covered a lot of the law enforcement, first responder angle. I got really close to some hero firefighters and hero police officers and made some great friends. One of the guys that was in the first precinct, he was on patrol that day when the planes hit. He took me into Ground Zero a bunch of times, and so I was in there. I was actually in there when President Bush made that famous speech. I became really good friends with the guy, and he's like a good friend of mine to this day. When I was at the smaller papers, I always wanted to be at a big metropolitan daily and cover national stories. But when 9/11 happened, it was too big, and you didn't want it. It was apocalyptic down there, frankly. It was a war zone. I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't know what I was walking into, and it changed me forever. I got pretty burned out, to be honest with you, and I moved over to the political team and covered the 2004 Republican and national political conventions. But whenever there was a big, huge story, I would jump in. And then when the marathon bombings happened, I ended up being thrown right into the middle of all that. I look at St. Patty's Day and The marathon is like the start of spring. It's a rite of passage for Bostonians and such an iconic day for Boston. I mean, there's runners from over 100 countries, 30,000 runners, college kids everywhere. Everyone, it's just a really happy day. It's Patriots Day. It's funny, I mentioned the police officer down at 9/11 that became a good friend of mine. Almost immediately after the bombings happened, he texted me and said, "Are you all right?" And a couple hours later, he texted me and he said, "Take good notes. You're gonna do a book about this." So I did exactly what he said. I took the best notes I've probably ever taken in my life. So I drove over to the finish line and just parked and ran into the scene and just started interviewing witnesses. And, you know, there was a lot of confusion. I talked to a lot of people who were runners or families of runners that were looking for their loved ones. No one really was sure what to make of it. So I talked to my contacts in the police department, and all the information I got, I fed back to the desk, and I got sent over to the first press conference, which was at the Westin Copley. It was heavily guarded, you know, officers with machine guns. There was bomb-sniffing dogs. Governor Patrick came out and basically said, you know, we've been attacked, and told us what little information they had at the time, that they needed help from the public. They had a good handle on things right from the beginning. They knew they were dealing with a terror attack. They immediately appealed to the public for help. They quelled the panic, but they took steps to protect the public. On Thursday, I finally finished my day at like 10 o'clock that night, started falling asleep with the baby, watching the news, and it came on that Sean Collier was shot and killed in Cambridge. I literally took the baby and I gave the baby back to my wife, and I said, I gotta go. And she was like, what are you talking about? And I said, it's gotta be connected. Immediately the desk called me, my news desk, and was like, can you get out there? So I started heading out there, and as I was heading to MIT, the WATERTOWN thing started happening, and my boss just said, the corner of Dexter and Laurel Street in WATERTOWN, something's going on there, there's bombs, they're shooting, just get there. When I got there, the gunfire and the bombs had just stopped. There was still smoke in the air, there's people running around, they were putting up police tape, there was a lot of chaos. There's a lot of bars in that area, and there was a lot of like young, drunk college kids coming home from the bars, walking around those streets. The cops didn't know who was who, it was dark out. They're looking for two young men who just shot at cops and threw bombs at police officers, so everyone was a suspect. So I ended up just staying through the night and through the next night until they caught the kid. Brought me right back to 9/11 when I got off that train and was walking through Manhattan, and I had that same feeling downtown with, you know, the metal barricades everywhere and cops and uncertainty. And when things like that happen, I just, as a journalist, you have a responsibility. You know, you have the skills to be able to find out what happened. You have the contacts to be able to get the truth. And I feel like that's my responsibility in my career. And that's how I approach it, where it's going to be an incident of historical significance, and I want to make sure I get it right. 20th Century Fox owns the rights to our book, and they've got a producer on board and a director, and they're coming out to Boston, meeting with the characters that we have in our book, and that we've already got a, they've already got a script. It's the folks who wrote The Fighter and The Finest Hours. So it's an A-list team. Couldn't be prouder. It's a tragedy, but there's so many stories of inspiration and heroism that came out of the marathon, and those are the stories we try to tell while honoring the folks that lost their lives. And our hope is that the movie will do that same justice.